Good job, Monroe. You got us on another watch list. For those of you who don't know, The Unfinished Swan is a first-person adventure game. Wait, I know. Walking sim, but hear me out. It's a first-person adventure game co-developed by Giant Sparrow, also known for What Remains of Edith Finch, and Santa Monica Studio, known for, well, a lot, but probably best known for the God of War series. Just know they've helped with quite a few quality titles, and maybe some not-so-quality titles. The story follows the 10-year-old Monroe, following the death of his mother, a painter whose only immediately notable trait is that she's never finished any of her over 300 works. After he's placed in an orphanage that is absolutely ruthless, by the way, and only allows him to keep a single painting by his mother, like, get fucked, kid, Monroe chooses his favorite of the paintings, a swan with an unfinished neck, and, hence you have the namesake of the game. One night, Monroe wakes up to find the swan missing from the painting, and boom, you have the setup to a great 2-hour tech demo. So development on The Unfinished Swan began back in the far-off year of 2008, being submitted into the Independent Games Festival, where it was one of the finalists losing out to Tag: The Power of Paint, later being picked up by Sony under an incubation deal and deciding to change the atmosphere of the game from desolate to more of a children's book feel. Side note here, an incubation deal in this case means Sony provided funding, space, equipment, and had Santa Monica Studio give assistance to Giant Sparrow. Being picked up by Sony is a win as far as I'm concerned, seeing as the Power of Paint team didn't get to fully realize their game and were instead absorbed into Valve to work on certain puzzle elements of Portal 2. Not bad ones, but still. Which is an achievement on its own, but my point still stands. The game opens with a blanket of white after the opening cutscene, until the player acts and tosses paint from Monroe's paintbrush, which, off the bat, is a great and responsive mechanic that just feels really good to use and works great as a way to drive players where the devs wanted, because it's just fun to chuck paint at things in the environment, and the sound effect for the splatters just... The sound design really stands out in the game as well, but especially in the beginning, where you complete the entire first section of the game without the paint mechanic, and by using the sound design and sound cues. I mean, there's even an achievement for doing it with only 3 or less paintballs, meaning the devs knew people could manage it. Even if it is a pain in the ass. I mean, I was going to do it for this video just to prove my point, but, I mean, kept getting like 3/4 of the way through and then fucking up because I'm an idiot, so, I mean, hey, it is what it is. Another real standout point for the game is the music composed by Joel Corelitz, who got his break into the industry through this game, and he's done a fantastic job. Every piece of music in this game is great, and true to intentions he expressed in interviews about the music acting as a companion piece to Monroe in the game, often kicking in when making progress through an area or when entering a new section. It's just really fitting. I really cannot express what a good job Corelitz did, and I would recommend finding the soundtrack to the game and giving it a listen because it really is stellar. Corelitz would unfortunately not return for Giant Sparrow's next outing, instead going on to work with some big names such as Japan Studio, Kojima Productions on Death Stranding, and with 343 Industries on the upcoming Halo Infinite, among others, so he's doing pretty damn good for himself. A really cool thing the game does periodically as well is letting the player look back over areas they've already been through, and it's a nice little nod to see where you came through and get a small glimpse of the entire stage. The game also has interspersed bits of narration that the player can interact with or read themselves that help to add to the storybook feeling, and it really clicks well with the rest of the storybook elements. After Monroe catches up to the swan, he takes a dive and plays with gravity for all of maybe 15 seconds, then decides that that's boring and moves on. Like, seriously, I can't imagine literally anyone spending more than maybe 1 minute in this area, even on their first run, and it sucks because it's just such a cool concept and it's just already gone. The whole teleporting and jumping down a hole and getting portaled to another area thing, like, it's done. Just one and done. Like, alright, whatever, you don't want to overstay your welcome, that's fine, I guess I understand. After that, we get our first glimpse of something that's not a blanket of white or a sprinkle of gold, and it's a shadow showing stairs. Neat. Next up, we get a little backstory on the area we're in and find out, apparently it's pretty fucking hard to see when everything looks like God's boss arena, so the king decided to paint some shadows. Next up, we get to see the castle and all its shadowy glory, and we even get a glimpse of some houses off to the side along with a sword, which kind of makes you think what the hell anyone could be fighting here, at least on land. After trashing the king's studio apartment and painting all his model kits a solid black, we get a glimpse of my favorite area in the game, a sprawling labyrinth that looks like it stretches for miles, leading up to the castle, and it's over in less than 2 minutes. Yeah, The game even gives you the solution in the King Studio. And if that's not enough, you still get hints from the goose in the form of footprints. I know the game is directed towards children, but damn! I was playing Metal Gear Solid before I could even read. I should hope little Timmy can remember to take a right, 2 lefts, and another fucking right, or else the bastard shouldn't have found his way out of the womb. Which just sucks even more because the Labyrinth overview is accompanied by a view of the castle, which should by itself compel you to go forward, and it does a good job of that. You know, it really does make you want to move forward. Next up, we get teleported to the top of the castle for a shot that both pisses me off, now that we can actually see the whole labyrinth that we just skipped, and does a great job of showing an area that we already went through by showing off in the distance the whole of the labyrinth and any paint we managed to spatter around in the playable area. The game also humanizes the king here by showing that he's just like all of our dads and runs from his problems too. The only difference is, he paints a boat and ours use alcohol and iron fists. Monroe then finds a balloon and floats away, chasing the Swan, and decides to thin out the gene pool a bit by reaching out for it and falling out of the basket. Fortunately for Monroe, and unfortunate for future generations, he manages to land in the water. And the game, with a runtime of less than an hour and a half, makes a joke about the story being shorter. Chapter 2 opens by introducing us to a new city, a giant, and a floating ship, setting this section up for a ton of new set pieces. We also find in our first puzzle that our black paint has now turned a watercolor blue and will wash away after a short period of time, doing a pretty nice job of tying the game mechanics and the story together. Adding emphasis to the whole nearly drowning thing with watercolor blue is a pretty nice touch. The game gives a quick explanation of the canal-like area we traverse in this early section by explaining the king was once a potter and that his new subjects in this new city decided since they had no bathroom to relieve themselves in, they should just do it in this godlike being's pot because, they don't seem to value their lives very much. Moving further into the sewers, we begin to see more of the game's collectible, the balloons, which are a decent enough distraction to break up the walking sections, though most of them are laid out in the open areas, and only a select few are actually hidden in secret areas. Monroe next lets his inner ape out by climbing up a scaffolding and crane, and we get our first look at the new color introduced to the palette, in the form of a tree off in the distance, along with a better look at the airship from earlier. Monroe's natural reaction to this is, of course, to, disturb the local wildlife and break shit. Once we reach the palace, we find out that not only does Monroe have terroristic tendencies, but that the king's subjects absolutely deserve to be wiped out for sabotaging his cleanup effort. We'll come across another bit of backstory explaining why the king keeps trying to build his kingdoms to last since his sandcastle was washed away as a kid. What did you expect? This is a kid's game. So far we're batting better than some Naughty Dog titles anyways. Once Monroe finishes monkey barring over the shark pit, we're also given an explanation to the sea monster we saw earlier. And we also get some weirdly sobering dialogue about the king and his war against the monster. The more the game tells about the king, the more I honestly think he's a Chad, doing what the weak masses wouldn't, which is only reinforced by the kingdom abandoning him at the slightest sign of effort. Once we reach the airship, Monroe chases the Swan once more and finally has a thought in his brain that he may be being led somewhere, which is immediately followed by his attempt to off himself. Unfortunately, again, he manages to luck out, finding himself in a pitch-black forest. On the bright side, this part is probably my favorite gameplay-wise, as we find ourselves smacking giant fruits to light up an area so we can make it past man-eating spiders. The game really starts to feel like an adventure at this point, which is great. Unfortunately, again, there really is no tension since if you do manage to die, which is very hard by the way, you just get plopped back down almost exactly where you were. We then make our way down the weirdest lazy river ride I have ever seen and come out in front of a house. We then learn that the king is into some kinky shit as he creates a female version of himself in an attempt to start a family. After moving out back and through a portal to another world, we're then introduced to a new mechanic, where we draw blueprints with our paint and create boxes we can stand on and that will show up in the real world. I really like this, but I also wish it had a bigger effect than it does on the real world, but I understand why it wouldn't, because you could easily just make a section much harder than it needs to be for yourself, or even easily skip sections. After this, we find out that the king painted the house and committed a grave sin and decided to impregnate his female self. We once again hop universes, and after finishing the floor for the king and climbing a tower using our blueprint power, we get a nice nod to Journey, another title from Santa Monica Studio. Then we return to the real world to move on. I want to mention real quick that the song being played by the mobile here is actually a nice version of the title theme, and I love it, but I couldn't really think of anywhere else to put it, so here you are. You appreciate the small things like that when you have a pea-sized brain like mine because they make you feel smart. Once we're done with that, we throw ourselves off the back balcony, and I'm really starting to realize why I like Monroe, and it's because our solutions to most problems are the same. Terrorism and jumping off shit. I mean, at this point, we haven't proven that we aren't being led somewhere to become a patsy for a swan god. We've just proven that the king and his queen were terrible, incompetent people. Next, we find out that the queen abandoned the king the night before she was given birth, only adding to her list of sins against man, and we see the king slide into a depressive slump, having his child go missing for over 9 years. We also find that his powers failed him and he entered a coma sometime after. Like, holy shit, this is all being dropped on us just prior to an escape sequence, and we find out that the king may have just given up on being alive because his kid was stolen a day before it was to be born. I think the escape sequence may just be here to get us to stop thinking about the king's fate at this point. However, after escaping the floodwaters, we meet the king in person, and he conveniently wakes up to tell us that the dream he was having was what was keeping him in his coma. The game then segues into a nice cross-hatched room that the king grew up in, and the art style, which I really like by the way, is used for this room alone. That's it. Which is just such a shame because I think it looks super neat. But we find that the king heard a knocking in his dream, to which no one was there once he exited. At this point, the game takes us back through the areas we've already been before with the same paint splatters, and the king narrating everything. We also get what is basically a playable credits section, which is always a win in my book. The king also laments that all of his creations will be destroyed one day, and we get to swap back to Monroe, where we stand over the king's corpse in a somber moment that's, honestly probably too deep for me to analyze properly, or something like that. Then we get a moment where we play as a giant fetishist fantasy and grow in size, destroying the king's monuments, and a nice moment where you actually get to look back on all the different sections of the game. The king then wraps up the story giving his magic paintbrush Monroe, who, if you haven't pieced it together yet, is actually the king and queen's son. The king then sends Monroe on his way, telling him to be a better man than he was, and the story ends on a sweet moment where Monroe gets up in the middle of the night and does what would have made his mom happy, and paints a swan and 2 babies with it. All in all, the Unfinished Swan is a nice experience with beautiful music and engaging enough gameplay. If you notice, most of my complaints with the game come from a lack of expanding on ideas present. My first replay of the game for this video clocked in at just over 1.5 hours, and I was dicking around a lot in it. It really comes down to that. My biggest complaint with the game is simply that there isn't enough of the game. I wanted more because what was there was great, and while the extras you get from balloons, such as the prototype level and cheat codes, are nice, it just isn't the same. And that's not the same as having more of the final product. As far as I'm concerned, call it what you will, a walking sim or not, the Unfinished Swan is great. And if the biggest complaint I can levy against it is that I want more, I want more puzzle, story, game, more of this world, I consider that a success, because this game is stuck in my head since its release in 2014, and my memory of it and my opinions has stayed the same. It's good, and if you've never experienced it, I would highly recommend it if you get the chance to play it. Holy crap, this took a ton of time. I'm mostly just rewriting and trying to narrow down 7 years of thoughts into a consumable form. I'm not planning on just doing videos in this format, the super highly edited stuff, or at least highly edited for me. I actually plan on doing some shorter stuff, just opinion-wise, but I appreciate you sticking around until the end of the video, and I wanted to thank you. If you think you like it, please let me know. Let me know any opinions you have, and drop a like and subscribe. I hope you have a beautiful day, and stay safe.
It's me again, Mr. New Vegas, reminding you that you're nobody till somebody loves you, and that somebody